Welcome, everybody. Today, we are going to be talking about real-time cyber situational awareness for GDPR. And from Lumeta Corporation, we have myself, Sanjay Raja. I'm CMO of Lumeta. And we also have Joe Sorial, VP of Products. And we will be co-presenting today and on this particular topic. And with that, let's get started. So the first thing that we'll talk about as part of this particular subject is let's talk about the impact of GDPR and also the specific security ramifications based on the new regulations that are coming out. Just a quick review of some of the rules and the impact that it has. The first thing is that the new regulations take effect on May 2018, so a little less than 6 months from now. It does increase the data privacy of individuals, and what this really means is that there are stricter standards, but also regulatory bodies within the EU can now take stronger legal action and provide higher fines. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The other significant change to the old rule around data privacy in the EU is really focused on the storage of user data and must be compliant with the standards that have been put forth. The new rule enhances this particular area where now even anyone who processes data in transit, for example, is still must be compliant with the new regulations. So not just storage, it's now even data in motion that needs to be secured as well. The penalties have become much tougher, 4% of annual global sales or 20 million euros. And that's whichever number is greater. So it can have a pretty significant impact on any company. So essentially, the maximum fine, say at a minimum, is 20 million euros, and it certainly can go much higher than that depending on what's levied by the different regulatory bodies. Especially because they've changed rules around data in transit, pretty much it's any company that is storing or processing personal data from an EU resident. So any multinational, US corporation, anything in overseas in other countries that is handling in any sort of way personal data of EU residents is subject to these laws. When we look at one of the components of impact too is that within 72 hours is the time frame or window that's allowed for reporting a breach. So once an organization finds a breach, they have that period of time before they have to notify the Data Protection Authority, the DPA. At that point, it can be public, right? The DPA can disclose it publicly if they choose to. So you have a very short window to be able to really get a handle on what's going on, remediate the situation potentially, certainly have your incident response plan in place, which again is being evaluated as well. So it's not really a lot of time in most cases, to be able to get a handle on what's going on. Beyond the IT department that's really focused on trying to understand what occurred and try to fix the problem, the response group is expected to have the chief privacy officer, legal representation, and they can be the same person. Any sort of risk management personnel, certainly PR, because obviously as it's disclosed, you want to be able to talk to the public in a way that makes them feel confident about what's occurred, and certainly there's an impact to the finance team, especially whether it has to do with concerns over forecasting of revenues, but also any sort of potential fines that may occur depending on how the breach happened. When we look at GDPR priorities and some of the readiness factors out there, there's some surveys that were done. A law firm in the UK, interviewed about 2,000 business leaders, and then what was interesting about this is related to the 72-hour reporting window. Only 33% of these business leaders felt like they could achieve that 72-hour window. 40% said they would report after that period regulated by GDPR, and then 10% really didn't understand that they had to report anything. They didn't know about the 72-hour limit that's been introduced. So 10% said, well, we weren't going to report anything. And then there was 17% that had some knowledge of the new rule around the 72-hour reporting period, but they didn't feel confident in saying when they would be able to report, the breach, within or over 72 hours. They just had no idea how long it would take. So, what this equates to is that the penalties at a minimum is going to be 50% of the companies that were interviewed here, because they just said they would not make that 72-hour window. That will probably incur fines unless there's a really good reason for being able to not make that window. and then and readiness certainly isn't one of those reasons, but the potential could be as high as 67% of the companies here will get some sort of fine based on being non-compliant with GDPR regulations if a breach occurs. So again, pretty significant in terms of the impact there. When we look at another survey by PwC that was done this year, 54% said that this was one of the highest priorities they had, or the highest priority, excuse me, in terms of their particular privacy and security program. 24% said they spent about under $1 million, but the majority of folks said they spend between $1 to $10 million, significant capital outlay to improve the infrastructure, security posture, and just get your GDPR program in place. 9% was going to spend over $10 million. I have an asterisk there because obviously the math doesn't quite add up. It should be about 8%, but I'm assuming the survey had some rounding, rounding up a little bit, and so the percentage is a little bit higher than 100% because of that rounding. But it's pretty close. So when we look at specific infrastructure needs, there are three pillars that we've identified based on the different rules set place and different articles set place by GDPR. The first is around data processing and storage assessment. This really, and the second one is breach prevention and program implementation. The third is really around monitoring and detection. I get a little bit more detail about what those mean. The first one is really understanding where the data exists, identifying which data is critical, being able to make sure that you know what the current set of controls and access rights are, look at additional security measures, and then, decide based on your current posture, your current rules around access, around protection mechanisms, understanding what you're, and this is important to document. The GDPR, regulation bodies want to be able to see that information. So they want to know you went through this process. At that point, the next phase is really around being able to restrict access, right? Figure out different ways to do that. And there are multiple things that can come to do that, anything from IAM or identity access solutions to segmentation. Defining, documenting, and then implementing the security controls that you put forward is critical too. And again, it will be used by auditors to make sure that you went through the steps necessary to control the data. And then continuous evaluation, right? Doing it one time is not good enough. Being able to constantly make sure that you're keeping up to date with any changes in infrastructure, users, et cetera, is going to be important because it can have ramifications on the overall program. And then the last phase, the monitoring, detection, and response execution pillar is really focused on monitoring access, making sure that you're continuing to restrict access to those resources, having a strong threat detection program. If a breach has occurred, being able to identify that, and then execute the incident response plan once a breach is found. And this is really, I consider the three pillars to really be a representative of, kind of before, during, and after the whole process of being able to make sure you're complying with GDPR regulations, because again, it's definitely a life cycle in terms of how it's done. And you can tell that there's a repeat where you go back and continue to evaluate, assess your situation, strengthen your controls, implementing security technologies, and then continue to monitor and identify any sort of threat activity. So it's a cycle that will continue. When we look at some specific details around security and specifically infrastructure security, it really is understanding the assets that are holding the data and processing the data. It is being able to assess your segmentation policies and understand what you have today and where you want to go. As part of that, the next phase around breach prevention is really, first of all, it's understanding these new assets or all the assets you've discovered is being able to understand changes that are occurring as well. Most infrastructure solutions can detect changes, periodically, but you really need to understand what's going on in real time to provide a better picture of what's going on. Testing and properly executing any new segmentation or additional segmentation policies to control access more effectively is going to be important, because if you have holes in how your firewall policies are, for example, you have the potential for an attacker being able to exploit that for breach purposes. And then we look at monitoring, understanding changes, I mentioned earlier, are going to be important, but that also is monitoring for change as well. So again, as I mentioned, real-time discovery up top, it's also being able to monitor consistently any sort of network device endpoint change. VMs move all the time, mobile devices come on board. Being able to detect those and see how not only those devices coming out of the network, but how the network can be impacted is important. This helps us understand suspicious behaviors that can lead to threat activity and certainly breach activity in compromised systems. And then, as part of the incident response plan, the network context gleaned by understanding all this data and doing effective real-time monitoring means I can be much more efficient in being able to shrink the window in terms of when I can at least have an incident response plan in place, let alone understand how the breach occurred. That's critical when you have that 72-hour window. So the more context I can get for a security team to work with the network team can really accelerate the teams working together to be able to understand the breach and again, come up with the response plan to be able to clean it up or at least restrict it or control it from exploding into a much bigger problem. So let's talk about some network security challenges for GDPR. This is where Joe Sorrell will take over for a period of time. Joe, I'll open the floor to you.
Thanks, Sanjay. So as Sanjay mentioned, I'll be discussing some of the security challenges associated with compliance and maintaining compliance with GDPR. And then the next section, I'll discuss some best practices for achieving that compliance and, again, maintaining it. So when we look at the challenges of GDPR, they're really not very different from some of the challenges that we face in a traditional network, whether it's corporate network or some other type of network that we want to protect and secure. And really, at the bottom of it all is the networks today and the endpoints today are much more transient in time. So they're always coming and going. There's a constant flow of changes in network infrastructure, in the number of endpoints and how those endpoints are behaving. And that's really what drives security professionals crazy, because without really understanding what's going on out there, it's really hard to manage and secure all of those devices. So when we look at the network complexity, there's the introduction of mobile and SDN, and really what that ends up doing is making things a little bit more opaque in that devices aren't really stagnant and hardwire connected anymore. And managing and securing those ends up becoming a challenge. We've seen risk from acquisitions, from suppliers, from partners, any of those connections being unsecure or unknown, or frankly, just acquiring a company that doesn't have the same level of security practices does end up introducing risk. And that could be an issue if we're looking to protect user data and avoid some of the fines that we discussed earlier. The movement to clouds, really this started many years ago with virtualization. So devices and gear is no longer sitting in a closet somewhere that could be touched and counted and audited. Now with virtualization, there's virtual machines that are again much more transient. And then when we look at the movement to cloud, these virtual applications and machines are no longer sitting in my own infrastructure. They're sitting in infrastructure that I no longer control. So obviously that could be an issue, and if these things aren't secured and managed properly, they could be an entry point for the bad guys. And then we look at the explosion of IoT and industrial control devices that all of a sudden IP enabled, and these are really devices that are very small footprint, very low power, really not built with security in mind. So it's definitely an entry point and an area where somebody with malicious intent can get in and get a foothold into the network. And via lateral movement now, we're exposed if segmentation policies aren't in place and aren't keeping the data protected that needs to be protected. So with all of this change and the pace of the change, you have to ask yourself, well, if we can't see these devices or network, how do we protect them? If we don't have endpoint agents in place, how do we push policy or how do we enforce policy? Do we understand what are the various leak paths in and out of my GDPR network, so that if there's a path there, this data could be exfiltrated out, which is obviously a problem. And then are we able to detect threats in those enclaves once they are protected, to make sure that everything is in place and is not compromised. And in the event that there is a problem, can we go back and remediate it effectively and make sure that we're able to identify that or able to announce that, yes, a breach happened within 72 hours and we do have a handle on it, which could be a problem in terms of announcing that there's a breach and not really having control of the situation. So with all of this change, in Lumeta's experience, what we've seen is most of our users and our customers, before we get in and do our assessments, our POCs, and our final deployments, is that there is a 40% visibility gap And that stretches all the way from network devices, endpoints, cloud, and a lot of those devices end up being unknown or unmanaged, which creates a big problem if you're looking to lock down an area and make sure that you have sufficient coverage and sufficient security policies in place. So if this visibility gap is in place and it's available, it makes it pretty difficult to answer some pretty basic questions. And again, these are questions that we need to ask ourselves for any network we want to secure. But with GDPR and the fines and the regulations that we've discussed, the pain is a little bit more acute because of the size of those fines. So in terms of visibility and just understanding what's out there, really we need to ask ourselves, do we know all of the IP address space that's in use? Do we understand where our edge is of a particular segment or our entire enterprise relative to the internet? Are there any unmanaged forwarders or devices that are capable of forwarding traffic, or virtual machines or cloud infrastructure that's connected to my network? And is that connected to a sensitive area that houses or processes user data, for example? So that's the visibility piece, and really closing that gap allows us to do a better job with endpoint management, for example, allows us to do a better job with vulnerability management, vulnerability assessment, and that we have a better view on all of the assets out there, and we're able to proactively scan them and maintain them. In terms of breach, the problem here is lack of visibility. So if you don't understand what devices are out there, you may not understand if there are any devices that are compromised, and really need the visibility to be able to say, here's everything that I know about, now let me go in and assess whether or not these things are behaving as they should. Being able to look at threat flows, for example, and understand whether or not there are any communications that are happening to any known bad actors. And really, this is done via ingesting, processing, analyzing threat intelligence data. There's a number of really good vendors out there, as well as a number of pretty good open source lists that can be used for that type of activity. And same thing with Tor. We've seen more and more activity using Tor to obfuscate malicious behavior. So as we've seen with some of the ransomware attacks or some of the malware that's out there, Tor is actually being used more and more for command and control. So for example, in an area like GDPR, we would expect absolutely zero Tor traffic. And to the extent that we're able to identify that, that's a clear indication of something bad happening that needs to be remediated immediately. And then in terms of data exfiltration and leak paths, it's really all about making sure that there's segmentation policies in place, and really testing those segmentation policies in real time to make sure that nothing bad is happening. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of the other trends that are happening around cloud and IoT may give the bad guys a foothold into the organization, but it's really the lateral movement into the GDPR network that's going to get some folks in trouble, because that's going to be the path in and the path out for data. So the problem right now is there are a lot of other solutions that are in place that claim visibility, and they do a pretty good job in their areas of responsibility. So when we look at vulnerability management and endpoint solutions, these guys do give you very good visibility into the endpoints that they have access to. So for example, if I have an agent on a machine, I'm able to identify exactly what's going on with the machine. If my vulnerability scanner has both protocol access as well as credentials, it can do a very good job of identifying CVEs, so I can patch those. But really, where these solutions that sit in the stack end up having a hard time is identifying the unknowns and the unmanaged. And really, it's not until we have all of those under control that we're able to do a holistic vulnerability management program and roll out endpoint agents everywhere. SIMs that ingest logs, net flow collectors, PCAP type tools, again, do a good job for areas where they have visibility. So to the extent that I'm able to collect logs and ingest and correlate them into a SIM, that's great. But we've also seen that the first thing that folks do when they do get into a network with malicious intent is that they disable logging, or they update and compromise logs, basically to cover their tracks. So without being able to, with relying on with relying on logs alone, you could be left exposed in the event of a breach. NetFlow and PCAP, again, they do a great job at collecting the data that they need to collect, but they need to understand what all the networks are that are out there to make sure that collection is happening as in place. And again, with NAC solutions, it's a similar problem. You need access to broadcast, you need access to the switches that are controlling policy enforcement to make sure that devices that should be coming in and out are properly provisioned. So with all that said, because of these gaps in visibility, you end up losing a lot of, losing a handle on what's really out there, the type of breach activity, and whether or not proper segmentation is in place. So with that, let's talk about best practices. And again, a lot of the best practices that I'm going to be discussing here are really applicable to all networks, whether they're corporate networks or cloud networks, but certainly for GDPR networks because of the level of sensitivity there. So to get a good handle on things, we need to understand exactly what's going on in these networks in real time. So that's basically being able to listen for network changes, whether they be BGP or OSPF or broadcast, and be able to exercise those changes to see exactly where they're taking us to get additional context. And in a GDPR network especially, I would expect that network to be on full lockdown. So really, in terms of network infrastructure changes or route changes, those are things that are going to be planned out well in advance and executed methodically. So to the extent that we're seeing things that we don't expect in terms of endpoints joining or network changes, we need to be able to identify those and investigate them immediately. And really, the same thing goes for our corporate network, be it finance or HR or engineering or areas that are holding intellectual properties, for example. The same remains true in that we want to be able to understand how those networks are operating and changing in real time. And really, once we have all of that data, now we're able to make it available to things like SIM solutions so that they have record of some of these changes. We want to be able to make that data available to vulnerability assessment solutions and endpoint solutions to make sure that we have sufficient coverage and holistic coverage in all of those areas that are being examined as new endpoints are joining. The next use case or the next area of focus is around segmentation and ensuring there are no leak paths in or out of a protected network. So in this slide, I have our operations center, which is doing the monitoring. I have a GDPR network and a corporate network. Corporate network could be, substituted for guest or, some area of the network, a partner area, for example. And then in the last cloud on the bottom, I have the internet. So really what we want to do here is make sure that there are absolutely zero leak path or zero unauthorized connections from my GDPR network to my corporate network or my GDPR network out to the open internet. Because again, if these things are present, these are going to be the first issues with the firewall that get exploited and become an entry point for the bad guys and become data exfiltration points as well. So being able to get a handle on these and test these in real time becomes very, very important to protect areas of the network that are hosting data, that are storing data, or that may be processing personal data. And then once all of these types of changes are understood, once we understand our segmentation policy and make sure that everything is being enforced properly, get rid of unauthorized leak paths, really the next step is to make sure that there's not any breach activity that is happening within that protected enclave. So what we're looking at here is trying to identify bad flows that may be happening in a protected network. So for example, again, I mentioned threat intelligence, taking that, looking at how threat intelligence correlates with NetFlow. So being able to correlate source and destination IP addresses with IP addresses of known bad actors, or being able to correlate NetFlow source and destination IP addresses with IP addresses in the Tor list. And then having the network context and the visibility to be able to go back and say, okay, well, I've seen that this conversation is happening, it shouldn't be happening. What in my infrastructure is responsible for that conversation? And it's not until we can identify that one machine or that group of machines that we're able to go in and quarantine them, disconnect them, and remediate them immediately. So again, it's a three-way play between network visibility, ensuring there are no leak paths in or out of our protected networks, and then looking within our protected networks and making sure that there aren't any indicators of breach, such as communications to known bad actors or Tor. So let me pause here and give it back to Sanjay to discuss how Lumeta can help with GDPR compliance.
Great, thanks, Joe. So in terms of the areas that Lumeta focuses on, and our flagship product is Lumeta Spectre, we provide real-time cyber situational awareness. And what that means is that we're providing an enhanced level of network infrastructure real-time visibility. This is where we can identify all your infrastructure across the network, endpoints, cloud infrastructure, devices, like IoT devices, for example. And outside of finding them, we can find 40% more than any other solution can. And this is where we eliminate blind spots to provide 100% coverage of your infrastructure end to end. In doing so, we're also able to monitor that infrastructure in real time to detect against threats, but also detect the sort of changes that are occurring. And this is Lumeta is unique in terms of we are actually detecting any sort of change to the network and any impact on the network as it happens. It isn't a case where we're polling or taking snapshots of configurations or information and then saying, oh, the network changed at point A and then a little while later at point B. We're actually telling you as a change occurs. Again, that's very critical to be able to understanding threats that are starting to emerge within the network. And then the other piece too is that we're able to really do this change detection and discovery without having the use of agents. And we hear a lot in the marketplace about customers not wanting to deploy additional agents as they've expanded their endpoint technologies. Again, we don't require agents to be able to do the things that we can do. The last portion is really around segmentation analytics, and what this means is that we're able to validate how well your segmentation policies are working, and really help you to build your segmentation out effectively, where you are restricting access to users that shouldn't have access to the protected data that you're looking to really secure. As well as we're detecting things like leak paths and understanding when potential violations of that segmentation are occurring that may go as far out to the internet to a known malware site, as an example. And again, all this is done without agents. Well, when we look at really being able to eliminate the blind spots, which is really the core of being able to secure your critical assets and data within your IT environment, we have done a study across our customer base over several years, and we kind of pulled out these 4 verticals, which are the ones that certainly we cover retail and entertainment and other areas, but these are the majority of our customers that fall into one of these 4 vertical areas. When we look at the presumed endpoint count, that's the number that is given to us, as in the customer says, this is what we know about, this is what we manage actively. And the discovered endpoints are when we install our technology, we can see a huge number of endpoints in some cases that they weren't aware of and they weren't managing on an active basis or didn't have any sort of tools installed on to secure. The visibility gap, you can see the percentages below. Those are the average across each one of those, but we have seen much higher. In some cases, we've seen 120%, which is a huge number. It seems almost unbelievable, but we have had cases where it's that high. And as you can see here, we've gone down as low as about 12. Sometimes we've gone down to about 5 to 10%, but in general, the average is 40% in terms of the visibility gap we offer, for the entire infrastructure, and certainly endpoints are a big part of that. And one of the things that we note as well, when you look at ransomware, for example, and when WannaCry specifically as an example, WannaCry was very successful because vulnerability assessment software, and certainly EDR, endpoint threat detection and response, and even Next-Gen AV, a lot of times they talk about being able to have visibility into the endpoints and being able to see all of them. Well, they really aren't able to. They weren't able to discover all of them, really understand, within the network, find all the different enclaves that may host different endpoints or different devices. And because of that, even though companies had assessment tools, had EDR tools, they didn't have them installed everywhere. And when that occurred, WannaCry was able to infect those systems and be able to take them over, which made the attack very successful and also spread very quickly. So, being able to identify these systems, to have it patched, up to date with the latest security, make sure vulnerability lockdowns is critical for, securing customer data. The other component too, which is, sometimes a bit surprising to people, is that the number of unknown networks. This is a case where either networks were set up, by shadow IT, people are trying to implement shadow IT, or there were networks that were kind of, fallen off the map that people don't remember anymore, or they were set up by a different group. There's various reasons for having unknown networks within an organization, and again, the numbers are quite high, especially for government, as you can see. It's one of those things where if you find the unknown network, you're now finding an additional set of endpoints as well and devices to protect. When attackers move throughout the network and they have, they laterally move across different areas, they find these different enclaves of unknown networks and endpoints, and those are the ones that they understand to be able to infect very often. So again, finding these networks, finding these endpoints is critical. The other area which is surprising is unauthorized forwarding devices. Now, I know we have seen some in finance, so that number is a little bit below average. It's certainly not zero, but in the government we've seen a huge number of those, and it's because those routers and switches aren't locked down from a management standpoint as well as they should be, and an attacker can actually go in and manipulate those routers and switches to set up new forwarding paths. So this is when that's unauthorized activity, and it's very hard to detect. And it's something Lumeta can do. We can tell you if a change has occurred within a forwarding path that seems suspicious, which again can be an indicator of an attacker being able to take over a router and switch. And we've seen that, a lot of the large manufacturers have had plenty of vulnerabilities and flaws in their routers and switches. This is an area that we'd be able to identify any of those being exploited. And then non-responding networks tend to be networks that have just, are not reachable by traditional polling or pinging methods. And this is where we have enhanced technology and to be able to really find those networks, even if traditional things like SNMP monitoring or other management monitoring tools, network monitoring tools, have kind of lost these networks. And when they get lost, of course, they aren't added to the list. They are monitored actively, and certainly the endpoints are not able to be discovered. So again, this is another area that we're able to find. You can see there can be some huge numbers there. The other piece too is around leak path, to internet identified. There's a no against high tech. What this really means is it's within minutes. This is when we first get installed. Have we had an occurrence where we found a leak path immediately? And in the 3 cases, yes, we have. But really, leak path identification goes over time. You may not have one today, or you may plug one today, but 3 months from now, 4 months from now, another one is created, and that's indicative of an attacker running some sort of malware, either trying to exfiltrate data, set up a command and control connection, those type of things. And it's unauthorized traffic and a path being created to enable the attacker to be successful and breach systems. So this is something that we can identify right away. And again, it's very unique to Lumeta in terms of how we're able to do that accurately. And we can do that 100%. So in terms of some of the techniques we use and how we actually do things, and some examples here is, so at Lumeta, we look at from a discovery, understanding the network perspective, and really getting that ability, we can really understand sort of changes, any sort of things going on at the dynamic edge. And that's a very difficult area to monitor because it changes so frequently, in terms of devices coming in and out, certainly paths being created to the internet, very hard to watch and monitor and understand when there are suspicious behaviors going on. Certainly in the core, that's a critical area where being able to understand, maybe even hijack DNS infrastructure, some of these unauthorized forwarders, understand if your known networks and IP addresses, how they're working, is critical as well. And then the last piece is really these rogue networks and devices, unauthorized routers being created, shadow networks, shadow infrastructure, VMs being spun up that were not expected. These are the types of things we can find. And certainly into the wireless infrastructure, that tends to be a little bit less secure very often. And, that can be taken over as, and certainly a compromised entry point. But in general, that's a very dangerous area that, isn't always locked down as well as it should be. These are things that we can identify and be able to flag right away. We take that information and then we run it through security intelligence that we gather. So we actually are bundled Accenture's iDefense, and it used to be Verisign iDefense, and now it's owned by Accenture Security. We bundle that with our product, but we also pull in feeds from emerging threats and open source, and we can even find some other ways to pull in some custom feeds if we need to. This is where we operationalize the threat intelligence to now do a much better job of, the unique network context we're gathering paired with that intelligence means we can identify much more quickly things like command and control activity, threat flows, which are anomalous behaviors that are indicative of a threat pattern. Being able to understand zombie nodes and Tor nodes and, ports being created that can be used for exfiltration of data as an example. Tor nodes are used very often to be able to encrypt and hide attack activity. Most organizations don't really allow Tor or want Tor to be running on their network. Well, this is where we can identify that and identify that as malicious behavior. Certainly leaking devices is another piece we've talked about. And then at the endpoint as well, being able to understand all the different IP addresses that are rogue or shadow or unknown, and then even the zombies that may or may not be managed by EDR, but we can certainly get EDR involved where we're starting to secure those more actively and even quarantine them as needed. And again, as I mentioned, the Tor stuff and some of the flows and threat leaks, we can do all that from the endpoint across the network and even extend it to the cloud and identifying the infrastructure in the cloud and do the same thing there. So really, Lumeta doesn't have any limitation in terms of how we work in the cloud in terms of performing some of these analytics, especially in a VMware vCloud environment. So, at the end of the day, Lumeta was not going to solve all of your security problems, right? We need to work within the security application investment that you've made in various security applications, in terms of doing layering, especially. And if you look at the typical security applications that are listed on the right, we work with all these different types of applications to either ingest data or feed data to improve how well they work. So a great example is that we're able to feed vulnerability scanners with information around unknown devices to make sure that they've fully scanned those devices during their scan windows. Without that, you're missing huge numbers of endpoints potentially or servers that are left vulnerable and aren't patched appropriately. So that's a great example of a way we're feeding data to a solution. But again, our goal is that we want to be able to help you leverage your existing security investments and improve your overall security operations program. That means we really need to integrate and work with these different solutions in different ways. So, as a proof point to that, here's an example of some of the vendors we either are able to feed data to or are much more heavily integrated where we can share, even show some dashboard information on our UI, but also share information on some of the dashboards they've built for Lumeta. And Joe will show you a little bit of what we do there in a demo coming up soon. But you can tell, really covering the full gamut of different security applications and certainly around some of the network visibility things that you require to secure your networks more effectively as well, whether it's access policy management and segmentation or just providing overall visibility. We're aggregating data from different sources or looking at understanding DNS and being able to help you understand threats and again, provide that enhanced visibility across these different areas. So, in summary, Lumeta is really focused on helping with those three pillars. And again, I kind of talked about that as before, during, and after, a GDPR security incident where, the first piece is really understanding, eliminating those blind spots of your infrastructure that is hosting that critical data you're trying to protect as part of GDPR. That also means understanding, which systems are vulnerable, being able to help endpoint vendors be able to support their solutions on those particular endpoints and devices to make sure they're secured properly. So it's also securing them more effectively. When it comes to during an attack, understanding the dynamic changes that are occurring, whether in the network, at the endpoint, within the cloud, is critical to making sure that there's authorized behavior and activity going on. But there could be something as simple as a misconfiguration that does expose you to an attacker being able to take advantage of. Being able to identify leak paths that are intentional or unintentional, threat behaviors that we're seeing, access violations. Those are things that are part of the overall threat detection program specified by GDPR as being critical to protecting data. And then really the third piece is around, okay, I identified a breach, I understand that there's something either about to be exfiltrated or going to be exfiltrated. Am I able to prevent the impact from that being too severe? Once the breach has occurred, am I able to have the necessary network context information to accelerate the remediation of those problems and put forth a solid incident response plan that makes customers feel like, yes, we were able to stop too much damage from being done. We're taking steps to lock down our systems and our network to prevent further escalation of the attack. And again, we can identify exactly what was impacted. And these are the types of things that we can help with after, based on our understanding of the real-time changes of the network, the discovery of all the assets, being able to detect, how those changes may have caused threats to be successful or a breach to occur. And I want to emphasize, we are the only vendor that really does real-time monitoring. Most other vendors rely on devices to request access to the network before they start monitoring, if they can do that at all, or they do periodic polling of assets and systems, but they're not looking at it as it changes in real time. It's something that we can do. And again, this is across that entire spectrum of networks, endpoints, IoT devices, any sort of device connected to the network really, including servers, virtual machine infrastructure, and anything that extends into the cloud, we can monitor. So just a quick case study. This is a U.S. multinational bank. They were looking at a reduction in time to notification, based on how long, it takes them to discover a breach and how long they're able to really report it and disclose it publicly. Not necessarily related to GDPR, but this particular use case is relevant to GDPR in the sense that they were looking to reduce their overall ability to respond once a breach is found versus disclosure. So again, very similar to some of the requirements set up by GDPR. The first part is that they really didn't feel confident about their asset discovery, and it's something that we were able to help them with. The dynamic changes in the network, they recognize that they have a lot of systems that go on and offline to the network, so this is where the edge kind of gets thrashed a bit. And they also are, working with partners, but they're also concerned about acquisitions and other branches that they've pulled in, or other tech companies they've pulled in, because there's some consolidation that always goes on in the banking industry. When that happens, they want to feel confidence in the networks and the infrastructure that they're pulling in and starting to connect to their own network. And that's something they were interested in as well. And then, leak path is always an issue, right? Whether it's at a POS system, at an ATM machine, at a branch office, whether through the data center, anywhere where they can see a leak path being created as an indicator of compromise. There's really no reason for some of those systems to be able to send data out to the internet from, a POS system, for example. It should be all tunneled back to corporate in some fashion. And then, they had a relatively large network, which shows that the scale they were looking to is pretty significant and something that we would have to be able to handle. Kind of covered most of it, but I think one of the big things here is that, we worked with some of their existing platforms that they had, which is, they had Qualys for vulnerability assessment, Carbon Black for ER, and, Splunk for their SIEM. This is something where we could help optimize each one of those to help protect against vulnerabilities and patch systems more effectively, really protect all the endpoints, not just the ones that they could find, and make sure that they're up to date with that. And then track changes, at the Security Operations Center, which really relied on Splunk as the overall event dashboard for understanding whether there are threats going on, or understanding certain incidents that are occurring that could lead to a threat and then to, of course, a breach. So this is where we could feed them additional network context to help them understand where and when things were occurring. And again, I think the other piece too is that we help them identify, any of their leak paths that may have already existed before we came in the door. Again, a lot of those weren't necessarily based on an attack. Some of them were just created based on misconfigurations, and locking those down was something that they wanted to do. So again, this is where we really help them significantly to improve their overall security posture. So with that, let me turn it back to Joe to do a quick demo.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay. Before diving into the demo, I just wanted to give a quick overview about Lumeta Spectre, mainly the architecture and how some of the components work. So Lumeta Spectre is made up of, it's a two-tier architecture. At the top end of things is what we call the Spectre Command Center. This is where, this is the brains of the operation. So that's where the configuration, the reporting, the UI, the analysis, all of that happens at the command center, as well as our HDFS data store. And this is really what powers a lot of our ability to ingest lots of data from lots of disparate sources, as well as perform real-time analysis and correlation. And the command center does have a level or ability to listen to network changes and exercise those changes via the active indexing techniques that we've discussed earlier. But to the extent that we don't have protocol reach into some of the segmented parts of the network, we rely on what we call Spectre Scouts, and basically make a connection between the command center and the scout. And now the scouts serve as eyes and ears for the command center in those enclaves to detect and report on network changes and new endpoints. The other concept I wanted to relay is the notion of zones. So the way you configure Lumeta Spectre is you can create different zones for different areas of your network. So you think about, your personal data network versus your corporate network. You can configure zones around different geographic locations. So you may have Asia, North America, South America, for example. It's really how you picture your network and how you think about your network. You can configure discovery and reporting and analysis based on those zones of interest. So with that, let me jump over to a quick demo. What I have here is Lumeta Spectre. I'm logged into the command center. We're looking at the dashboard view. This is really where a user gets dropped off as soon as they log in. The dashboards are very, very flexible. You can create your own. You can add widgets. You can actually set default dashboards. So if you're a user and you're interested in one particular thing, whether it's vulnerability management, for example, or network visibility, you can configure and set a dashboard as your default, and you'll be dropped into that dashboard every time you log into the product. Same with whether they're system dashboards, which we come bundled with a whole bunch of different ones around different use cases, or create your own. They're basically treated the same. So what I'm showing here is our breach detection dashboard. This is the dashboard that shows activity that shouldn't be happening in any particular network. What we're doing here is, as I mentioned in the breach analysis slide, we're correlating threat intelligence data with NetFlow to identify bad conversations. So we're looking at NetFlow source and destination IP addresses and matching them to IP addresses that are showing up in threat intelligence. And as Sanjay mentioned, the product, each license that goes out the door is bundled with Accenture iDefense. So we really try to make it very much turnkey for users to be able to go in, get spun up very quickly, and then identify bad activity, really, really quickly. So here, the threat IP address happens to be the source IP address. This happened to come from emerging threats. It's attributed to known compromised or known hostile type campaigns with this particular threat score, again, as indicated by emerging threats. And we show other information, other metadata around the flow, so the source and destination ports, the types of protocol used, and which zone. We do a similar type of test around Tor. So here we're actually ingesting the Tor list, and we're able to correlate the flows that are happening to Tor. And I actually clicked on my GDPR network here, and I'm showing, again, all of the net flows that were collected that are associated with Tor. And what's nice about this is from here, I can very much click in to get additional context about which the device is. So by clicking on this IP address, which is not in the Tor list, this is actually something that is sitting in my infrastructure, I can go ahead and say, okay, well, show me that device on a map. And we go ahead and open up the map and expand our topology and show exactly where that device resides within the full context of the network. Just while I'm on the map, I just want to mention that this map operates in real time. You can see that there are alert, warn, and info level notifications that are associated with this map, which are basically type alerts that I've subscribed to that are important to me around devices discovered in lockdown networks, for example, or leak paths that are discovered. And you can subscribe and configure the level of the warning to whatever you'd like from within the notifications panel up under systems here. So here's the device that we've identified. And if we want to get additional metadata about that device, we can right-click on it, click on device details, and now we're able to get even more context. So the device IP address, the MAC address, whether or not it's currently active, whether or not it's currently SNMP accessible, the types of discovery that it has responded to back to Spectre as it was interrogating it, whether it was known or in target list, when it was first observed, and when was the last time I had a conversation with it. So you could see this was first observed end of August, and I just had a conversation with it this morning. So this device is actually very much up and running. It's virtual. It's running Linux CentOS, and we actually show you how we matched that device profile in terms of the responses that we got back from it, where it is in the network as indicated by attributes. We do test ports, so we can tell you which ports we tested that came back open, which ports we tested that came back closed. And Sanjay mentioned, we actually talked about segmentation analytics. I'll spend a minute talking about this, but this device is actually leaking, and it's leaking both inbound and outbound. So from there, let me go back and show you some other dashboards around endpoint management, for example. So we do have an integration with McAfee EPO. We're an SIA partner, so we have an extension that was certified and blessed by McAfee. And here, what we're looking to do, or the main focus of this use case, is to make sure that there are EPO agents on all of my endpoints. Make sure we have coverage for security and management basically everywhere. So we pull the McAfee EPO server, we get a list of all of the devices that it knows about, and we compare that against the list of devices that Lumeta Spectre has discovered. And to the extent that there are devices that EPO doesn't know about, we actually go ahead and flag those. So you can see here I have a widget that talks about all of the unmanaged devices by EPO. And then on the bottom here, we have another widget that talks about here's the intersection of devices that both EPO and Spectre knows about. So the idea there is we want to minimize the top list and maximize this bottom list. And let's just jump over here to my EPO dashboard. Part of the integration is that we push that list of unmanaged devices over into EPO so that an agent could be spun up on it. And again, this is to make things as easy as possible so that the EPO person responsible for EPO deployment can log onto this dashboard every morning, see what's lacking coverage, and push an agent on it immediately. So here's a list of devices that I pushed over into EPO. I'm just going to click on one of them and just show you additional context. So for example, here's an unmanaged device. So I can go ahead and say, all right, well, this looks like it's a virtual machine, and I can go ahead and say, all right, well, I need to deploy an agent on it. And then from the bottom, I can take an action and deploy an agent. Again, very, very quick, because we want to make sure that these things get locked down and secured as soon as they are discovered. Also mentioned integration with vulnerability management solution. We have one, in this case, with Qualys, is what we're showing here. And again, it's a very similar dashboard to what we've seen in EPO, in that we're looking at the list of devices that Qualys knows about, bouncing it against the list of devices that Spectre knows about, and flagging the differences. So here are all of the devices that are unmanaged by Qualys. And we do a similar thing here in that this list gets pushed into Qualys, and we actually create an asset group in Qualys called Lumeta Discovered. So that, again, the person responsible for the vulnerability management program at an organization can go ahead and look at that Lumeta Discovered asset group and either kick off a vulnerability scan immediately on those devices, or bring them into some of the asset groups that are getting scanned on a regular basis to make sure we have full coverage. And again, we highlight the devices where we have coverage by both products. And again, we want to minimize that top list as much as possible and maximize this list right here. The last area I want to focus on is on leak paths. So we have this dashboard called Dynamic Edge, and this is where we flag all of the leak paths that we've discovered. So again, the leak path here is in the network that I call GDPR. There are several other networks we have configured here, whether it's AWS or corporate or guest. So what we're doing here is testing our GDPR network for leak paths into other portions of the network where there shouldn't be any connectivity. And again, we're flagging those by inbound, outbound. We're also flagging forwarders that are leaking out. So those are obviously areas to focus on and knock down very, very quickly, because if we knock these down, chances are we're knocking down a whole bunch of other devices that are connecting via this forwarder. But to get additional context, again, I can go ahead and click on one of the devices to get additional information. I can see it on a map, like we've seen earlier, where it gets expanded out, and we get to see it in context of all of the other devices that it's connected to and it's near. And again, I can right-click on it, get additional details about that devices, and really understand, you know, who is this device, who does it belong to, how is it responding, what software is running on it, and how do I quickly and properly disable it or quarantine it. And again, you can see the leak path response here. It's via ICMP, and it's bidirectional in that it's both inbound and outbound. So that's it. I just wanted to give a quick flavor of the product and how it works. And let me kick it back to Sanjay.
Yes, thanks, Joe. That was great. Yeah, just to end up, I think we're done here. I hope everyone got a good understanding of some of the GDPR standards and how they relate to network security specifically, but certainly IT security overall. I try to paint a pretty good picture so that, again, you understand the impact, but also some things that you can do to really improve your security posture and make sure that you can reach that compliance that everyone's looking for, especially when dealing with any sort of EU customer data. So with that, I think we'll end the webinar today, and I appreciate everyone joining. Thank you.